So I hope you've had a rest since we went out. I hope you got some
Yes.
sleep and uh gained some weight and
Yeah,
all the rest
rested.
of that. Oh
Very much
gosh.
rested now.
I've had nothing but interviews since I got back, and I've been setting up more of the business side of this thing as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just and the 7-year-olds, the youngest daughter turned 7 today, so I'm just completely wiped.
I'll say
It's
I said happy birthday, even though I don't
Oh,
know.
thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. And I've been Binky the clown all day, So if yeah, it's one of those things. But she had a good time. Had a really good
Great,
time.
great.
I just jump into it anyway.
Yeah.
And I'm terrible at editing, so who knows what part of our conversations will stay in. And I think it's nice and natural that way. But we've known of each other for a while. We got to meet recently, which was great for me. To meet you, to sort of tap in to your brain a little bit and find out, what makes you tick and everything. But of course, a lot of people out there probably don't know a lot about how you got into this genre. So I'd just like to start by finding out how you got into cryptozoology. What was the defining moment that made you say, yeah, this is for me. This is what I want to do.
Well, my entrance to cryptozoology was basically a literary one. My mother, bless her, she always bought me books on zoology, and every now and again there would be a cryptozoological work sort of mixed in there somewhere. So I ended up with Bernard Hoiverman's On the Track of Unknown Animals
Yeah,
first, which was, I've got to say, truly changed my life and made me
yeah.
realise that, there probably are things out there that you don't know about of that
Classic
sort of
gateway
caliber.
drug. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And, also Exotic Zoology by Willie Lay, sorry. I love that book. Anything by Carl Schuker. I ended up
Mm.
with Mystery Cats of the World when I was very young and a couple of other ones. And that obviously led me into a very much a scientific approach towards that. So yeah, basically books really, Andy.
Well, I think and isn't that the best way to get into it? Because yes, it's great to have the clips and the documentaries and everything else that comes along with TV and media, social media especially, but there's something of a need for sensationalism to get the target audience on board with those things. So I
Mm,
always thought the difference between TV and books was that, books could give you the lowdown on what was actually being said or reported about these creatures, whereas TV had to give you some sort of entertainment in the meantime, or some sort of big find.
yeah,
Now, we had a big chat about your new book, which is coming out, The Cryptozoology of Cats. It's coming out really soon with Hangover Publishing.
yeah.
And I've recently got a copy of that. I've just started reading it, but I'm fascinated about it. And I guess, in a way, I realize I've never really thought about what is a cryptid cat? What defines that?
A cryptid cat. Oh well, it's just it is what it sounds like. Really, it's a cryptid. An unknown animal which closely resembles a member of the Felidae family, but obviously without biological material, we can't be certain what any cryptid is. So basically, it's a cryptid that resembles a cat and probably is, but also might not be.
And in relation to that, I remember you mentioned feliform
Mm,
cryptids when we were, and of course, there's a hint in the name,
yeah.
feliform cryptid. But are there types of feliform cryptids that do you have, I suppose, favorites that you're on the fence about as to whether they are cats or perhaps something else?
Well, the most famous of all, the prehistoric survivor category, really. Some of those could potentially be something unknown still. I think providing they were elaborated on through folklore, that might make that possible. But yeah, I think the smaller cats are obviously more likely. In fact, there has actually been a discovery of a new species of cat not too long ago. I don't know if you're aware of the Corsican wildcat.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, for a long, long time, that was debated whether or not that was actually a species in its own right. And I think in this year, March, I think this year, it was finally shown through genetic analysis to be its own unique endemic species. But that was known to the shepherds, of Corsica for generations, where they had all sorts of folklore attached to it. One being that it would attack the udders of ewes' goats, of
Mm.
the udders of ewes and goats. Um, Whether that behaviour is accurate, I doubt it very much, but they were certainly aware that it was an unusual cat, and it has recently turned out to be a unique species. So, yeah.
And with the Corsican wildcat, I mean, is this something that was? I didn't look into it very deeply. Is it something that was observed, that was known about, but it was ignored essentially, as similar to, let's say, the subspecies of grass snake that was found in the UK not so long ago, under our noses and thought to be something we were already familiar with? Or is this a cat that's so rare in a country that's pretty well explored that we just had no evidence that it existed?
For a very, very long time, there was no evidence for it whatsoever. It was just
Wow.
known through cryptozoological type evidence. It was known as the fox cat,
Mm.
because it's unusual morphology, which resembles a fox basically. And then in the I think it was the the late 19th century, early 20th century, they started turning up. And ever since then, there was a debate on whether or not they were actually a unique species or whether or not they were derived from the domestic cat.
Mm.
And the most recent results, which I say was in March, I think this year, categorically stated that the genetic evidence points to them being a unique endemic
Wow.
species.
Wow. And what do you think this teaches us, really, Carl, about being too overconfident in what we know, even within our own countries, a place like the UK or Corsica or any other small environment, especially an island, where it does seem to me that every so often, something is either rediscovered, especially in island territories that was thought to be extinct, or is found to be a complete unique species like the Corsican cat. And then suddenly everybody, is eating humble pie and very excited for a little while again. And, the very next day we're back to, no, we've got everything. This is all there is out there.
Mm. That's been the case ever since what Hooverman has called Cuvier's rash dictum. It's very much a biased attitude that there's nothing left to discover at all, despite the fact that new discoveries are fairly regularly made.
And do you think that's more to do with a sort of an inbuilt need to satiate ego within mankind, or is this like a protective instinct that we have, in the sense that we want to think that we know about everything that's out there because it makes us feel safe subconsciously?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of both. Yeah.
And let's talk about now. In your book, there, I mean, and it really is. I've only just started leafing through, but it really, really is so varied within this subject of cryptid cats. But you indicate that there could still be species of large big cats out there that we haven't discovered yet. I mean, how's that possible?
Well, there are certain places in the world, most notably South America, Africa, and some places in Asia, most notably Southeast Asia, which the habitat is still okay, and the populations are, I would say, low enough for something to have got by, but still big enough for them to have been reported. And so we've got our cryptozoological type data for them. In South America, most notably, you've got the sort of like considered to be an aquatic sort of saber-toothed cat, which they call basically a water tiger. That's the name they sort of give it. And that seems to be some sort of saber-tooth type animal. But whether or not it actually is, that's debatable, because obviously you get different identities put forward. Some people might think of it as a giant otter or something like that. Basically,
Yes.
the data we have in cryptozoology is never very specific. It can be open; it's often open to interpretation. So I think if we use a biological sort of standard, listen to ecology, listen to known sciences, we'll have a better chance of finding something and proving that the cryptozoological methodology does in fact work.
And would you say, in relation to that, our behavior as cryptozoologists and cryptozoology advocates or enthusiasts such as myself, the way that we record facts or evidence or indications of new species around the world is very important, and therefore has to follow a standard of some kind. Do you believe there needs to be a sort of a new diktat sent out there, almost pro forma, if you will, where all cryptozoology enthusiasts, be they Bigfooters or people who do with cryptic big cats or looking for strange bats, whatever it is, need to sort of go out there with a list of um, scientific activities that need to be adhered to in every investigation, evidence that needs to be sought and recorded. What do you think about that? Is that something that would help us all?
Yeah, I think so. I think I think there's room for both areas. I think as long as we keep cryptozoology close to like its zoological matriarch, if you like,
Mm.
we'll have more success. And once we've had more success, I mean, I don't even think of cryptozoology as a science. I think of it more as a gateway to zoological discoveries. You know,
Mm.
if we find something and it doesn't prove to be some sort of elaborate new species, I don't consider that to be a failure. I think that
Mm.
in terms of cryptozoology, that would still be quite successful because, you know, the animal existed. It was unusual enough to be reported.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the identity that's been put forward by the individual cryptozoologist, which has become popular, may be wrong. It doesn't
Yes.
mean that cryptozoology itself is wrong.
Yeah, so I suppose the Loch Ness monster would be a great example of this, whereas the plesiosaur theory is very, very popular. But if we do one day find a 40-foot long catfish or eel in the loch, that's really just as impressive. And
Absolutely.
however, you did mention to me before, it's strange that a lot of people would be disappointed by that.
Yeah, because a lot of people have polarized views and it's sort of both in cryptozoology and science, you know, that something's got to be what they think it is. But that, you know, that kind of misses the point, I think. Cryptozoology, as Feuvelman's always said, was, you know, he always considered himself to be like the Sherlock Holmes of zoology.
Mm.
And I think that's what cryptozoology is. It's a methodology where we can question what things are, go for what we think they are, see what the data tells us, and if it's not correct, you know, if it looks like something else is responsible for the data we're getting, then so be it.
Yeah, absolutely. Carl, in your book as well, you talk about emerging species of hybrid big cats. Now,
Mm,
that was really surprising to me because, of course, we're all aware of things like ligers and tigons and leopards and things like this that occur in captivity in a very restricted mode, in a sense. Like the active and specialized breeding programs have to be in place often to successfully
yeah.
create one of these hybrid big cats. But you seem to indicate that this is happening in the wild as well, and because of that, new species may be emerging.
Well, it's certainly possible that it has happened at some point in the wild and could have been observed. It doesn't mean that all the reports we have of that type of thing, for instance, like the Morosi, you know, the spotted lion,
Mm.
it's very unlikely that that would be a new species in its own right. It seems very, very likely that it's some sort of unusual mutation where, you know, its childhood spots are basically stayed on through into adulthood. So that's not a hybrid at all. But some of them could still be hybrids. It's not impossible. It's not particularly likely that a population will be sustained like that. That's very, very unlikely. But the chances of it happening every now and again is possible.
Mm.
Yeah, sure.
What about things like puma pods? I mean, there was talk recently of a sighting of in Britain, of all places, of a puma, an adult puma, and melanistic leopard being seen together.
Mm,
And the witness didn't seem entirely sure as to whether he was actually looking at two pumas, one melanistic and one, well, I
mm.
suppose one of the one natural puma. And I was under the impression that was near impossible, especially in the wild, but maybe had been achieved once or twice in captivity in the past. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose you've got to ask yourself what you think's more likely. I mean, the chances of a melanistic puma are very, very, very slim,
Mm,
but there's no genetic reason why they can't exist.
okay.
So, you know, there's a vague possibility that it might be correct. But the biggest problem I have is a behavioural issue. Um, Leopards and pumas, they well, it's difficult to say what would happen in Britain, isn't it? But you know, in general, if you put them together, they would fight. They don't get on. You know, the
Mm,
cats are like that in general. You know, they just can't stand rivals of roughly their own size being about. Um, but hybridization has occurred. You know, we have not occurred. Well, it has happened. We've done it in captivity. Um, so I don't know really.
No, I mean,
It's possible, but it's definitely possible.
but as far as you're aware, there isn't any particular biological reason if, say, in a sparsely populated environment, that's assuming there are big cats in the UK and there are solitary individuals wandering around it through large territories, rarely
Mm.
meeting a male or female of the same species. Perhaps these tight, biological conditions could bring these big cats together.
Yeah, I mean, when cats do mate in the wild, it's a very rough affair anyway, at best of times.
Mm,
Um, so it's still possible that it could have happened, and there could have been hybrid offspring at some point. Uh,
okay.
whether or not they're sustained as a population in that way, I doubt it.
Yeah. No, I mean, it does seem to be quite an anomaly. And coming on to the British big cat situation, in the UK, you do have a nice bit in the book about anomalous big cats around the world,
Mm,
but so clearly you've looked at this situation in Australia or in Germany, France, the United States, etc. What do all of these
yeah.
ABCs have, these anomalous big cats have in common around the world? Is there a uniting factor in their presence in these unlikely locales?
Only in their appearance. I mean, the most observed type of reported type is obviously the big black cat,
Mm,
which pretty much anywhere in the world you'll find reports of those, even in Hawaii, believe it or not.
wow.
Um, but the question is whether or not the ecology can sustain them as a population. I
Mm,
mean, the idea is put forward in Britain is that sometimes it's put forward that there are thousands of them, which
mm,
is a lot of cats. There should be more evidence of them if that were the case.
yeah.
In the national parks of Kenya, there's only like one leopard in every 10 square kilometers.
Yeah.
Whereas in Britain, I would expect it to be, it's got to be closer to one in every 500 square kilometers or
Mm,
something like that for them
mm.
to be out there and still remain a mystery.
When we were in relation to that, when we were recently on Exmoor looking for big cats, you mentioned that in a country like the UK, with this limitless prey species, especially, and there being a possible dearth of big cats, so a wide range or territory would be needed to perhaps find a mate that perhaps these animals could even cover 50 miles or more as
Mhm.
a territory. Now, with a territorial size like that in place, perhaps instead of thousands, could we be looking at something like 200?
Yeah, that would be a much more reasonable estimate. Yeah.
Hmm. And would you, and similarly to other big cats around the world, would you relate their presence to primarily to the Dangerous Wild Animals Act of 1976, or do you think there could be other release points throughout history that have also played a part in their presence here?
Oh, there absolutely are other release points. It starts really with the Roman Empire when they would bring
Hmm.
big cats here for gladiatorial battles. But yeah, there's been other times throughout history. The Victorians would bring them for hunting. The Dangerous Wild Animal Act, like you say, that's another important one. And since then, through the illegal pet trades,
Hmm.
I think they just keep escaping. Every now and again, they form a base population, which if more escapees top up that genetic line, then they could survive for much longer than that. But the chances of them being sustained just through wild individuals meeting wild born individuals meeting wild born individuals and mating and producing viable offspring, I don't think that's the answer to the phenomenon as a whole.
Yeah.
I think the most likely explanation is that there are fresh escapees that keep escaping, and they're the ones that are them and maybe their first, second generation offspring are the ones that are reported as genuine big cats.
Ah, I see. Yeah. Okay. So occasionally, basically, a few more cats enter the pot, as it were, and bring a bit
Yeah,
more flavor to the stew. And that did intrigue me actually, because I thought, okay, well, look, let's say in 1976 that let's say the 20 big cat owners didn't know what to do with these animals, couldn't keep them, couldn't send them to a zoo and let them go throughout the country. Well, that's 47 years ago. What life cycle does this animal have? Like 12 to 16 years in the wild, something like that? Leopard or a
yeah,
puma?
much shorter time.
Much
Yeah,
shorter
absolutely.
time. And also previously, docile pets, well, compared to a naturally wild animal too, having to go out and learn to fend for itself in the
Yeah,
wild in the British winters and all the rest of this stuff, it has always troubled me. What chance would they really have of mating and propagating and secretly, out of the sight of man and human populations, rearing cubs in the wild? It seems very, very tough. And yet, the sightings seem to increase year on year. And whether that's because there's so much awareness of the phenomenon now that every single large cat you see, whether it be a savanna, exotic species, or a large what are those Norwegian cats called? I forget. Big domestic ones.
Oh, like a Maine Coon.
A Maine Coon, or a large Maine Coon, or something like that, which seems to be the photos that we see all the time anyway. One of those things getting out and scaring, one of the local biddies, they are being reported more and more. So it's hard to match those two things together. The unlikelihood of them meeting and propagating and having enough fresh genetics to enter into the fold to keep going after 47 years, and the fact that people are seeing them all the time. How do we explain that?
I think the phenomenon is answered in more than one way. I think we probably have a genetic imperative that's built into us that tells us that whenever we see a quadruped, a dark quadruped at night, we don't know what it is.
Yeah,
I think it tells us that it's a large cat because that is the primary predator of our past, from our ancestral past. So I think it's like a fail-safe where we're basically told that's what it is and stay away from it, keep safe, stay alive. But that doesn't apply to all of them. Some reports are very, very credible, and but then again, reports of black cats are the most prominent. I mean, that in itself might suggest limited genetics. It's a recessive gene in leopards, melanism.
Exactly. I mean, how common is that in the wild? Not really very common at all, but it would have been common as a pet because of its beautiful, black coat.
Yes, it would have been prominent in its genetics. And if there was a limited population in the wild, you would expect that to keep reoccurring. That might become the standard type.
So there's something of a smoking gun there, I suppose, in the types of sightings. And I proposed this before. I wasn't the first person to propose. I had no way of really establishing any data to support it. But I had an idea a long time ago: could Britain unknowingly be host to one of the highest densities of melanistic leopards in the world? And it was a funny thought. It was a very funny thought because, of course, there's no way really to prove it. But the number of sightings compared to other countries where these melanistic cats are not common, I thought, well, yes, maybe could this weird bottleneck have led to this unlikely situation? Do you think that's a possibility? Or once again, are we seeing, is the beast of Exmoor also the beast of, 4 or 5 other local counties on its normal rounds in its large territory?
Well, they certainly have vast ranges, especially the puma. I mean, as a species, the puma has the largest range of any carnivore in the Western Hemisphere. They're found all the way from the very bottom of South America, almost, right up into Canada. So that species is very well suited could be very well suited to the British climate because, if you think about it like that, it would be quite warm, not too warm, not too cold. It would be kind of like Goldilocks' porridge in a way.
No, yeah, well, just right. Exactly.
It would be just right, yeah.
It would be just right. Like baby bear's porridge, yeah. I don't know, as a dad of young children, and obviously that symbolism is very dear to my heart. Well, there's something else regarding big cats, of course, and that is it's a cryptic big cats, especially it's a phenomena all around the world, and it's not just cats that are unknown to science, but it can be also animals that are in the wrong place, somewhere where they're not meant to exist, and that really neatly brings me to your recent expedition to Sumatra, where you actually went in search of the orang pendek and came back with some wonderful evidence of that, which we'll talk about in a bit. But incidentally, you discovered evidence for a cryptic big cat along the way. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I was already aware that there was this feliform cryptid, as I like to call them, that was reported from Sumatra through email correspondence with our guide, Dali Sangradaputra. He had already told me that there was this strange creature called Tinker, which basically means something along the lines of the creeping tiger. It's thought of in the folklore as some sort of were tiger. It's sometimes it's considered like a biped, sometimes it's a quadruped, and they give it human-like dexterity, like with it in its limbs. They say it can do human things. It thinks like a human. It's intelligent. Yeah, so basically, when I went out there, I made that a priority to search for. In fact, I've said many, many times that cryptozoologists would do well if they paid attention to cryptid cats maybe over anything else, because I'm sure that they have the better chance of being discovered just by their very nature. But yeah, we were out there. It was called Tinky. It didn't take us very long before we realised that the reports, the more credible reports at least, were describing something far more biological, far more like a standard tiger, if you like. And then we found tracks. Originally, we thought the tracks belonged to a clouded leopard, and then
Yeah.
eventually we found another set of tracks, and which were much larger, which were quite clearly from a tiger. And around that time, also, I was wandering through the jungle with Richard Freeman and Dali, and Dali called out that he thought the orang pendek was sort of off in the distance, rocking this palm, making a strange sort of chattering noise.
Wow.
So I said to Richard, "Oh, I'll run round there and I'll photograph it." As I ran round, I caught the back end of an animal, which at the time I thought, well, it could have possibly been a orang pendek because it was, it was orangey coloured. But since then, we actually recorded a tiger on our trail camera from the exact
Wow.
same area. Yeah, and when we got back, we checked out the data online and we checked with the WWF. It turns out that there really are no tigers reported from this particular area of Sumatra. The area is completely data deficient. So we basically use the cryptozoological methodology to provide actual usable ecological data which might benefit tigers in general. So I see that as a cryptozoological success.
Fantastic. That's the bucket list, isn't it? That's the dream. That's the dream find. And I
Yeah.
think that it really plays into what you said earlier again about finding something other than that which you went to discover. And it's still a big win.
Well, again, I've been saying for many years now that cryptid cats have the best chance of discovery, and they're perfect cryptids in many ways. They're exciting, they're enigmatic by their very nature, so they must have a good chance of being new species out there to be discovered. And I think that cryptozoologists, if we spent more attention to that kind of thing, I think we would have better chances and we would have more success.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now let's go back to Sumatra, the orang pendek. Richard Freeman has been there a few times. Many people from the UK, in fact, and the United States have traveled there in the past in search of this enigmatic upright ape, which is what we think it might be. Is the orang pendek sort of a Littlefoot of kind? Is it a Bigfoot-like creature? Is that what we're looking at, but on a smaller form? Or do you think that we're looking at sort of perhaps even a large monkey, like a macaque or something like that?
My personal opinion on that would be that it's most likely some sort of gibbon. I think that's the most plausible explanation. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily the case, and we have to follow the data to where it leads rather than pigeonholing. And I think that the orang pendek has a really good chance of being discovered, and it seems to be some sort of large animal, some sort of large mammal. It's probably a primate. Whether or not it's a prehistoric survivor, some sort of pre-human, I wouldn't like to say. In fact, we found that in some areas of Sumatra, people would describe it more as a ghost. And this was tended to be in more lowland areas, whereas where in the highlands, it was described more like an animal. And in that case, it was described more like an ape. But of course, there is also the reports from the same island of the what's it called, Andy? I've got to try and think what its name is now. I'll do a bit of editing here. What was it called?
Are you talking about Flores?
The Sumatra, the orang Kardil, the orang Kardil.
Oh, thank God! But this is a giant animal, isn't it?
Well, the orang pendek seems to be an ape. It does. Yeah. It does seem to be an ape. But obviously, there are also reports of this orang Kardil, which seems to be some sort of little human. But if you follow
Oh,
the
yes.
data back and you follow the
No, I've
information,
got it now. Yeah.
you find quite quickly that they sort of cross over quite, in the folklore.
So, I mean, and this actually happens a lot though with fairy folklore, where there seems to be a little people or diminutive pygmy type people in a certain area, but also something else that's also small but has more animalistic traits ascribed to it. Could it be a possibility that they're just, as in many archaic societies, there are one or two archaic coverall terms to describe certain types of creatures, in the same way that we used to call everything in the ocean a fish, etc. And that's why there's diminutive stature as well. It's why they're mingled together. They're all mixed together, but in fact, there could be something very, very different. One being an ape and the other being just a pygmy tribe of some kind.
Quite possibly. But either way, it's definitely people need to go out there, need to keep looking, because there is something to discover, and it needs to be cryptozoology. Cryptozoology puts in a lot of work in this way, in this manner.
Yeah.
So we deserve it. So I think that we need to make more of an effort and find it.
Absolutely. We have to be the finders. That's the whole point. Yeah, that these scientists need to back off and let us find this shit. Because there aren't a lot of cryptozoology finds out there, are there? Let's face it. And for example, it's very easy to explain that away. One, most of the funding is given to regular scientists. Why wouldn't it be? They're the qualified people out there conducting zoological research, and where I suppose the fringe people that have the luxury of looking for things that scientists could never get away with looking for. So that's something special. Now, tell us about your evidence for orang pendek in Sumatra, though, because you did capture some evidence recently, and you've made a documentary about the whole trip as well, which is very exciting. I think that's coming out quite soon. So what did you find there?
Yeah, we found some nice tracks. We found what seemed to be a very small footprint, which had an opposable type thumb, so opposable toe, if you like.
Oh, goodness.
And we also found what seemed to be a handprint. It was absolutely enormous in terms of its width. It had short, stubby fingers, so it clearly wasn't used for climbing about in trees as its primary function, if you like. But it was very, very small, very wide, but very small, kind of like a short, stubby-toed gorilla, if you like.
Wow. I mean, apart from the obvious differentiation with the human footprint, would you say that the primary portion of the foot was human-like, or at least meant for upright bipedal locomotion?
Yeah, it was plantigrade without a doubt. It was designed for walking on the bottoms of the flat of its foot. It did say there was evidence of an opposable thumb, but it didn't look like any known species that I've ever seen. It was very, very unusual. Wow. But yeah, that's the best evidence that we found, I would say, for the orang pendek in Sumatra.
And did this seem like this was fresh evidence? This was a fresh print?
Yeah, a couple of days old. In fact, I heard a really strange sort of call coming from the same area about 2 or 3 days before, which oddly enough has not really been recorded before, not been reported before. It sounded like the barking sound of a gorilla, but not a huge animal, much smaller animal, which interestingly enough hasn't really been reported before. And when Dali said
I've never heard that
in the woods, in the forest that he told us to go check out, that was a completely different sound. It was more like a cackling, laughing kind of sound. So what I heard, I don't really know what that was, but it was roughly in the direction where the tracks were found.
That is very, very interesting and a great find. And I assume you guys probably have a cast of the print as well. So that's
we do, yeah.
Yeah. And will there be castings available at some point in the near future as well for people to buy or to examine?
I should think so. At the moment, we're having them 3D scanned, and Jeff Maldron will be checking them out and giving his verdict on them first.
Okay, wow.
Based on that, though, yeah, sure.
I mean, this is basically, Carl, this is a really, really successful expedition. You know, you
Yeah, I
found
think so.
evidence of two cryptids in one locale, or at least one country,
Mm.
and come back with the goods. What's the name of the documentary about your expedition?
We haven't actually decided yet what we're going to call
Mm,
it.
okay.
Um, it's something along the lines of, Expedition Sumatra, something like that.
And is this going to be who's that being released by?
That will be through Dragonfly Films.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Any ideas when you're hoping to get it out and then people can get online and have a watch?
As soon as possible, really. It's just finding time to get everything done. The director over at Dragonfly is editing it as we speak.
Wow,
So as soon as possible, really. Hopefully we'll get it out for the end of this year. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
that's amazing. That's really amazing. Now, searching at least searching in the Far East, it's been one of my dreams, I think, for a long time. I always really wanted to go to the Shenandoah Forestry District to look for the Yeren,
Wow, yeah,
or to the um, I think it's the Chernang Valley Peninsula in Nepal. I believe it's in Nepal, to
hmm
look for the Telma,
yeah.
which is that diminutive Yeti, that little Yeti that's supposed to inhabit that area. And stories like yours about the orang pendek, so many of these sightings are similar all over the world. I start to wonder, well, could that be a large form of upright gibbon as well? And could the Junjati also be something similar? And going back to fairy folklore in Europe and Britain, could we have had some kind of population of hairy fairy folk as well that were entered into our fairy pantheon in ages of old, simply just because people didn't realize what it was they were looking at as a species?
Yeah, well, I think it's more likely that we probably met them in our prehistoric past as we
Mm.
arrived, on our way to Europe. Um, I don't know whether or not they were actually here. In fact, that the way that the folklore is attached to them implies that there may be some sort of folk memory from somewhere else.
Uh,
Um, so yeah, I don't know. Really, we're talking about severely data deficient cryptids. So we just need more. We need more information. It's just speculation until we have some sort of biological material.
yeah, yeah. And coming back to that, in fact, about the data that we need and folklore, do you find, and you mentioned something akin to this in your experience in Sumatra, about the knowledge in the lowlands compared to the knowledge in the uplands being folkloric to real life,
Mm,
experience? Do you find that the folklore tends to develop where one or two sightings have occurred and then there's an absence and the story grows
yeah,
around the creature, whereas where the creature is regularly known, the stories tend to center around general experiences with the real flesh and blood animal?
I do, and I think that that's a good differentiation there. We can focus on what seems to be more plausible in terms of biology. Obviously, in the lowlands, they seem to be describing something that they either see extremely rarely
Mm.
or it's just word of mouth because word of mouth can travel as far as the animals migration themselves,
Mm.
often further in fact. So yeah, but it seems like in the lowlands that they're describing something far more folkloric, an echo if you like of the real animal, whereas in the highlands it seems that that's the best place to find the animals themselves. They seem to be associated with that kind of terrain.
Mm. Mm. I remember hearing a reading from the deceased researchers, as far as Geordie Magrin, as far as from the Chitral Mountains, that Pakistan and Afghanistan in the Himalayas, that yes, once again, the lowland people had more of a spiritual assignment to these particular creatures, the Barmanu, yet saw them
Yeah,
rarely, whereas the
yeah.
upland people who regularly saw them just called them creatures,
Well, I
or
think this
whatever.
differentiation is solid data.
Mm,
The fact that it occurs all over the place says that we should definitely be focusing our efforts in montane areas.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, coming back to cryptozoology itself, I'm always interested in researchers' opinions about the scene that we're in, the situation that we're in, the moment, and their projections for the future of cryptozoology. So I really want to ask you, do we have a bright future ahead of us in cryptozoology, or are we sinking into a sort of P.T. Barnum-esque pit of 19th century circus sensationalism when it comes to cryptids because of social media, because of the need for content and various television documentaries, etc.? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we do need to be very careful. At the end of the day, since the 1950s, cryptozoology has been trying to make its way into mainstream science and be accepted as a legitimate study in itself. Again, I don't think of it as its own science. I think it's more useful if we think of it as a gateway to zoological discovery. It becomes zoology if we use the data in a responsible way. That doesn't mean that the searching for things that are not necessarily flesh and blood, that doesn't mean that it's a useless endeavor. In terms of folklore, it's fascinating. But I think if we want to show actual success and we want to actually finally break free from this pseudoscientific attitude, then I think we need to focus more on the more biologically plausible cryptids, yetis, orangutan, that kind of thing.
So no werewolves and dogman then, or creepers or night crawlers and
well, they are fascinating, and I'm glad that there are researchers that investigate that. But I think that if we focus on that, we really do minimize our chances of ever showing the value of cryptozoology.
Absolutely. I know we've got to close out, but I really wanted to just finally, just as the last question, come back to the prehistoric survivors. So, I think of the Mypalina or the Ipa, which I think is more or less the same thing probably, and other water tigers that may possibly be surviving, prehistoric survivors, saber-toothed cats, for want of a better word. Are these stories quite generally dispersed throughout areas of the world, or are there certain continents and regions where they predominate?
It's mainly South America and Africa predominantly. There are some reports from China, and to say there's also a report of something called the Chigao from Sumatra, which seems to be like a little saber tooth, if you like, if that's what it is. But yeah, mainly in terms of South America, Brazil is a reoccurring place where you seem to keep getting reports, and Central Africa as well. Central Africa is a bit of a hot spot. In South America, they tend to be considered more aquatic animals, whereas in Africa, you sort of get two types, where one of them is sort of, again, it's considered to be an aquatic animal. That's often called the water lion, or when they're slightly smaller, they're called water leopards. But they also have the mountain tigers, which seems to be again, some sort of saber-tooth type animal, but this time associated with mountainous areas and not so much swampland.
Wow.
And I would say the latter has a better chance because it doesn't violate too many laws of biology.
Yeah, well, I was wondering about that, the water tiger aspect. I mean, the jaguar is very comfortable in water, and so to a certain point, it is a tiger too. So, could this animal have just adapted to ambush tactics, ambush predation, based upon emerging from the water or at least using it as a cover to sneak up on its prey?
Yeah, I would say it's probably more likely that an animal would, rather than leaping out of the water to grab somebody, is grabbing people and dragging them into the water. Like you say, a jaguar will do that anyway. They're very, very adept swimmers. In fact, I've seen a footage recently of a jaguar dragging an anaconda from a lake.
Oh wow!
So they're they're perfectly capable in water. Yeah, sure.
I think I'm more afraid of a jaguar than I would be of a tiger, really. In the same way as I'd be more afraid of a bull shark than a great white.
That'd be very sensible.
Yeah, exactly. They just seem to have that devastating, predatory ability. And just finding people go, obviously people listening to this will kind of want to know about the book. When is the book coming out? Where can they find it? And it's more especially if they want to get in touch or they want to find out more information about you, where can they find you?
Well, my personal email is carmarshall83@live.com. They can always get me there. Um, what was the other one, Andy? I forgot what you said. Can we do that again?
And the book,
Let's do that again.
yeah, absolutely. Just 1 second.
Deja vu.
Yeah, you go for that. So I suppose the question really for everybody before you go is when and where is the book coming out? Where will it be available? When can they get it? And more especially, how can they get in contact with you if they want to share sightings or ask questions about your research?
Yeah, the book is being published by Hanger One, which is Doug Hicheck's company. Eminently in terms of time. Hopefully by Christmas would be great. And if they want to get hold of me, the best way to do that was through my personal email address, which is carmarshall83@live.com.
Fantastic. It's been awesome speaking to you, and especially after our deep dive into, expeditioning around the southwest of England recently, which was very, very, very good fun. And thanks for coming on.
You're welcome, Andy. Pleasure as always.